Emma Hartford stood frozen in the doorway of the upscale Italian restaurant, her breath catching in her throat as she watched the man she'd been secretly in love with for 2 years sit across from another woman, his nervous smile illuminated by candlelight. Marcus Chen, the kind, soft-spoken single father who worked in her company's finance department, was on what was clearly a blind date, and Emma felt her heart shatter into 1,000 pieces right there in the lobby. She had built an empire, commanded boardrooms full of powerful executives, negotiated million-dollar deals without flinching. But she had never found the courage to tell the man who made her coffee every morning before she even arrived at the office that she thought about him every single day. Now, watching him laugh at something his date said, Emma realized that her silence might have cost her everything that truly mattered. If you believe in second chances, in the courage it takes to be vulnerable, and in the power of love that breaks through every barrier we build around our hearts, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, comment below with your thoughts, and subscribe to this channel because this story is about to show you that it's never too late to fight for what your heart truly wants. Emma had first noticed Marcus 3 months after she'd taken over as CEO of Hartford Technologies, a company her late father had built from nothing. She'd been working 16-hour days, trying to prove to the board and to herself that she deserved the position, that she was more than just a name on a family tree. One particularly brutal morning, after a hostile takeover attempt had kept her up all night, she'd stumbled into the break room at 5:30 in the morning, exhausted and defeated, only to find Marcus already there, preparing 2 cups of coffee with the kind of careful attention most people reserved for far more important tasks. He'd looked up, seeing the exhaustion written across her face, and without a word, handed her one of the cups, prepared exactly the way she liked it, even though they'd never spoken before. Black coffee with just a hint of cinnamon, something she'd mentioned once in passing during a company meeting months earlier. That small act of kindness, that evidence that someone had actually listened to her, had seen her as a person rather than just a title, had cracked something open inside Emma's carefully constructed walls. Over the following months, those early morning encounters had become the highlight of Emma's days. She learned that Marcus was a widower, that he'd lost his wife to cancer 4 years ago, and that he was raising his 7-year-old daughter Lily entirely on his own. She learned that he volunteered at a children's hospital on weekends, that he loved old jazz music and terrible puns, and that his laugh, rare as it was, sounded like coming home after a long journey. She learned that he'd turned down 3 promotions because the increased hours would mean less time with his daughter, that he read Lily a story every single night without fail, and that he kept a photo of his late wife in his wallet, not out of inability to move forward, but out of respect for the love they'd shared. Emma had fallen in love with his integrity, his kindness, his unwavering devotion to his daughter, and the gentle way he moved through the world as if everyone deserved compassion and patience. But Emma had never said a word. As CEO, she'd convinced herself that any romantic overture would be inappropriate, that it would put Marcus in an uncomfortable position, that he might feel pressured or obligated to reciprocate because of the power imbalance between them. She'd told herself that a man like Marcus, who loved so deeply and purely, deserved someone without the complications that came with dating his boss, someone who could give him a simple, uncomplicated love. So she'd kept her feelings locked away, content to treasure their morning conversations and the occasional glimpse of him in the hallways, telling herself that having him in her life in any capacity was enough. Now, standing in that restaurant lobby, Emma watched as Marcus's date reached across the table and touched his hand, and something fierce and desperate rose up inside her chest. She thought about all the mornings she'd arrived early just to see him, all the company events where she'd positioned herself across the room just to watch him interact with his daughter when he'd brought her to family days, all the nights she'd lain awake wondering what it would feel like to be loved by someone like him. She thought about her father, who'd built his fortune through calculated risks and bold moves, who'd always told her that the only regrets worth having were the chances you didn't take, and she made a decision that terrified her more than any business negotiation ever had. Emma walked into that restaurant with her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. She moved between tables with the same confidence she brought to shareholder meetings, except this time her hands were trembling and her carefully maintained composure was threatening to crumble with every step. She reached Marcus's table just as he was mid-sentence, and when he looked up and saw her standing there, the surprise and confusion in his eyes almost made her turn around and flee. But then she saw something else flicker across his face, something that looked almost like hope, and she found the courage to speak. She heard herself apologizing to his date, her voice surprisingly steady despite the chaos raging inside her. She heard herself explaining that she needed to speak with Marcus urgently, that it was a matter that couldn't wait, and she saw the other woman's face shift from confusion to understanding to something almost like amusement as she gathered her things and graciously excused herself. And then Emma was sliding into the vacated chair, facing Marcus across the table, with nothing left to hide behind and nowhere left to run. The words tumbled out of her in a rush that was completely unlike her usual measured professional speech. She told him about the morning she'd started coming in early just to see him, about how his kindness had reminded her that there was still goodness in the world during the darkest period of her life, about how watching him be a father to Lily had shown her what real strength looked like. She told him that she understood if he couldn't see her as anything other than his boss, that she would completely respect his feelings and ensure that nothing changed at work if he didn't feel the same way, but that she couldn't let another day pass without him knowing that someone saw him, truly saw him, and thought he was absolutely extraordinary. She told him that she'd been terrified to say anything, terrified of the power imbalance and the complications and the possibility of losing even the small part of him she currently had in her life, but that watching him on that date had made her realize that living with fear was far worse than risking rejection. When she finally ran out of words, when her confession hung in the air between them like something fragile and precious, Emma forced herself to look directly into Marcus's eyes. What she saw there made her breath catch all over again. There were tears gathering in the corners of his eyes, and his expression was a mixture of disbelief, wonder, and something that looked remarkably like the same desperate hope she'd been carrying around for 2 years. Marcus's voice was rough with emotion when he finally spoke, and what he said next would replay in Emma's mind for the rest of her life. He told her that he'd been taking himself on practice dates for the past 3 months, forcing himself to meet other women through well-meaning friends and colleagues, desperately trying to move forward with his life and convince himself that he could develop feelings for someone, anyone, other than the brilliant, beautiful woman who made his heart race every time she walked into a room. He told her that he'd assumed someone like her, someone who could have anyone in the world, would never look twice at a widowed single father who worked in finance and whose idea of an exciting Friday night was building pillow forts with his daughter. He told her that he'd been in love with her since the morning she'd broken down crying in the break room after a particularly vicious board meeting, when she'd let him see past the CEO facade to the scared, grieving daughter who missed her father and wondered if she'd ever be enough, and he'd held her hand and told her that her father would be proud of the woman she'd become. If this story is touching your heart, if you're feeling the weight of chances not taken and words left unspoken, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to know that vulnerability is strength and that love is always worth the risk. Emma felt tears streaming down her face as she asked the question that had brought her to this moment, her voice breaking with emotion and hope and fear and desperate longing all tangled together. Why didn't you ask me out instead? Why did you put yourself through those practice dates when all I've ever wanted was to be the person sitting across from you at dinner, the person who gets to hear about Lily's day and share in your quiet moments and maybe, possibly, build something beautiful together? Marcus reached across the table and took both of her hands in his, and his touch was everything she'd imagined and more, warm and solid and real. He told her that he'd been too afraid of losing her completely, that having her as a friend and colleague seemed better than risking everything on the possibility that she might see him as more, that his therapist had been encouraging him to start dating again as a way to move forward, but that every date had only reinforced how much he wanted her instead. He told her that Lily asked about Miss Emma constantly, that his daughter had noticed how his whole face changed whenever Emma's name was mentioned, and that just last week, Lily had asked him point blank why he didn't marry the pretty lady who always remembered her birthday and asked about her ballet recitals. Before you leave this video, please take a moment to comment below and tell us about a time when you had to choose between staying safe and taking a leap of faith for love. Your story might inspire someone else to be brave. Emma and Marcus sat in that restaurant for 3 more hours, talking about everything they'd been too afraid to say, making plans for a first official date where Emma wouldn't be interrupting anyone else's evening, and discussing how they'd navigate their relationship at work with integrity and transparency. When Marcus finally walked her to her car, he kissed her forehead with a tenderness that promised everything she'd been afraid to hope for, and told her that tomorrow morning's coffee was going to taste sweeter than any they'd shared before, because now they both knew the truth. 6 months later, when Marcus proposed to Emma in that same restaurant at that same table while Lily watched with delight from a nearby booth, Emma would think about how close she'd come to letting fear win, to letting the love of her life slip away, because she'd been too afraid to be vulnerable. And she would be eternally grateful that on that one crucial night, she'd found the courage to walk through those restaurant doors and fight for what her heart had always known was right. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do isn't closing a business deal or commanding a boardroom, but simply admitting that they're human, that they're scared, and that they're willing to risk everything for a chance at real love. And sometimes, just sometimes, that leap of faith leads you exactly where you were always meant to be.